In the early 2010s, Myanmar was a nation in transition. After nearly 5 decades of brutal military rule, the military junta, facing increasing international pressure, began cautiously loosening its grip. Political prisoners were released. Censorship laws were lifted. The once banned National League for Democracy prepared to contest democratic elections. For the first time in decades, the people of Myanmar could speak, organize, and connect publicly and freely. It was into this space of newfound openness that Facebook arrived. At first it came quietly, a few smartphones here and there, young people using data connections to chat with friends. But the timing was perfect and catastrophic. Myanmar was a country just beginning to discover the internet, a society with little digital literacy and a population where the majority had never used a desktop computer. Facebook offered a gateway, a free, simple, image-driven platform that combined messaging, news, entertainment, and identity all in one feed. The results were immediate and overwhelming. In just a few years, Facebook became synonymous with the internet itself. For millions, opening Facebook was the same as going online. By 2016, nearly half of Myanmar's internet users were using Facebook. By 2017, that number reached over 80%. But this wasn't just adoption, it was dependency. Facebook became the country's primary source of news, its dominant communications tool, and its main platform for civic discussion. Yet this explosion in usage was not matched by infrastructure regulation or oversight. There were few Burmese-speaking moderators. There were no clear standards of content control in a country rife with ethnic tension. There was no significant investment in local journalism. And there was little effort either from Facebook or local authorities to educate users about the dangers of misinformation propaganda or algorithmic manipulation. It was a perfect storm. Myanmar was a nation scarred by ethnic divisions, particularly between the Buddhist majority and the Muslim Rohingya minority. Decades of state propaganda had painted the Rohingya as foreign invaders from Bangladesh, even though many had lived in Rakhine state for generations. They were denied citizenship under the 1982 nationality law. They were excluded from the census. They were rendered stateless by law and invisible by design. In this environment, Facebook became the new battleground. In the years leading up to 2017, military officials, ultra-nationalist monks, and anti-Muslim extremists began using Facebook to wage an information war. Pages were created to spread hate speech. False news stories circulated alleging that Rohingya men were raping Buddhist women. Rumors were posted about planned terrorist attacks. Videos many doctored showed Rohingya militants burning villages. The posts went viral, and Facebook's algorithms helped them, built to reward engagement. Facebook's newsfeed prioritized outrage. Content that sparked anger, fear, or indignation spread faster. Posts from nationalist figures like Ashin Wirathu, a monk banned from preaching by the government for his anti-Muslim rhetoric, were promoted by users, liked, shared, and algorithmically boosted. His sermons were filled with venom. He called Muslims mad dogs, accused them of trying to outbreed Buddhists, and warned of an Islamic takeover. His Facebook page had over 300,000 followers before it was finally removed far too late. For the Rohingya, the consequences were not digital, they were physical. In August 2017, following an attack by a Rohingya insurgent group on police outposts, the Myanmar military launched a brutal clearance operation in Rakhine state. But this was not a targeted counter-insurgency. It was a scorched earth campaign. Villages were razed, children were slaughtered, women were raped, men were executed, entire communities were burned to ash. Within weeks, over 700,000 Rohingya had fled to Bangladesh. Satellite imagery showed the before and after destruction of entire villages. Survivors recounted horrors that defied comprehension, and while the soldiers burned homes, Facebook burned with hate. In refugee camps across the border, survivors scrolled through their phones and found posts celebrating the violence. "Kill all the Kalars," one said using a racial slur. "They are not human." Others called for the extermination of all Rohingya terrorists. Photos of bodies were turned into memes. Videos of fleeing civilians were mocked in the comments. The line between real life and the digital world was obliterated. Facebook responded slowly and insufficiently. In 2018, a full year after the worst of the atrocities, the United Nations published a report concluding that Facebook had played a determining role in the violence. The independent international fact-finding mission on Myanmar stated that the platform had been used to incite hatred-fueled division and mobilize genocide. They described Facebook as a beast that had grown out of control. Even Facebook's own internal review admitted failure. In a 2018 blog post, the company stated, "We weren't doing enough to help prevent our platform from being used to foment division and incite offline violence. We agree that we can and should do more." It was an acknowledgement, but not an admission. No executives resigned. No compensation was offered to victims. The algorithms remained unchanged. What Facebook had enabled was not merely the spread of misinformation. It was the amplification of hatred at scale. The platform had taken decades of prejudice and turned it into weaponized virality. And it had done so without adequate oversight, transparency, or accountability. The company argued it was unprepared, that Myanmar had developed too fast, that the language was too unfamiliar, that the government hadn't warned them. But human rights groups had raised concerns for years. Warnings had been issued, and Facebook, flush with global expansion plans, chose growth over governance. Thousands of miles from the smoldering villages of Rakhine in the pristine tech campuses of Menlo Park, California, a different story was unfolding. Inside the glass and steel heart of Facebook's operations teams of engineers, policy managers, and content strategists worked at a furious pace, building the future of digital connection. But as Myanmar's crisis worsened, emails were sent, memos were drafted, meetings were held, and at each turn, a familiar decision emerged: delay, deny, deflect. The alarm bells had been ringing for years. In 2013, as hate speech in Myanmar surged online, civil society organizations began pleading with Facebook for intervention. Letters were sent listing examples of incitement to violence. Meetings were requested. Posts were flagged. The company's trust and safety team, small, overstretched, and with limited language capacity, acknowledged the requests, but offered little more than promises. By 2015, internal discussions had begun to surface within Facebook's ranks. Employees based in Asia raised concerns about the lack of Burmese language moderators. Others questioned whether the platform's policies were sufficient to deal with coordinated disinformation campaigns. But each request for resources, for staffing, for investment in local expertise ran into the same wall: prioritization. Facebook's growth strategy at the time was clear scale, first solve, later. Myanmar was part of Facebook's next billion users campaign, a frontier market, a land of opportunity. With mobile internet penetration skyrocketing, Facebook launched aggressive free basics campaigns, partnering with telecom providers to make Facebook usage zero-rated, no data charge, no barriers. The result was explosive adoption, but it also created a dangerously lopsided information ecosystem. Most users in Myanmar had no idea they were using a private company's product. To them, Facebook was the internet. There were no fact-checking infrastructures, no alternative news platforms, no media literacy campaigns. It was a monologue disguised as dialogue, and it was being flooded with hate. Inside Facebook, some employees saw the writing on the wall. In 2017, a small team tasked with preventing election interference began asking hard questions about global platform risks. Myanmar was mentioned. Documents circulated internally warned that bad actors were using Facebook to manipulate public opinion. Yet the bulk of resources still flowed toward Western markets, particularly the United States and Europe. The crisis in Myanmar remained low priority. Part of the problem was scale. Facebook boasted over 2 billion users, billions of posts per day. Moderating content in real time required immense human and algorithmic infrastructure. And Burmese, with its complex script and relatively limited global usage, lacked the linguistic datasets that powered AI moderation. But the deeper issue wasn't technical, it was cultural. Within Facebook's leadership, there was a fundamental blind spot, a belief that open connection, more speech, and global presence were inherently good. It was the utopian myth of Silicon Valley that platforms could be neutral conduits free of moral responsibility. That if people misused the system, it was not the system's fault. That belief had consequences. In 2017, as the Myanmar military unleashed its campaign against the Rohingya, Facebook's systems were still boosting anti-Muslim content. Memes calling for extermination were shared widely. False stories of jihadist plots were algorithmically amplified. Graphic videos of alleged Rohingya crimes circulated unchecked. By the time Facebook removed some of the worst pages, the damage had been done. Internally, employees pushed back. A leaked memo from a senior Facebook researcher stated, "We have evidence that people use Facebook to foment ethnic violence. And yet, we have no tools to stop them. We have systematically failed to address this." That memo was not an outlier. In the years that followed, whistleblowers continued to come forward. In 2021, former Facebook employee Frances Haugen testified before the US Congress stating, "Facebook knows its products can fuel hate and incite violence, and they do not take adequate steps to stop it in places where it matters most." She cited Myanmar explicitly, but Facebook's public statements remained cautious. They admitted to mistakes. They acknowledged a lack of foresight. They commissioned third-party audits like the 2018 report by Business for Social Responsibility (BSR), which concluded that Facebook had not done enough to prevent incitement in Myanmar. Yet even then, Facebook did not agree to implement all recommendations. Some were deemed not feasible. Meanwhile, the consequences of inaction continued to unfold. In refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, where hundreds of thousands of Rohingya had fled, survivors described how Facebook posts helped justify their neighbor's betrayal. "My friend turned on me," one woman said. "He read a post that said Rohingya were planning to kill Buddhists. That's all it took." In Rakhine, remaining Rohingya communities were isolated, ghettoized, deprived of movement, and denied access to Facebook's evolving digital economy. In the absence of justice or reparations, the wounds festered. Facebook, now rebranded as Meta, continued to grow. It invested in the metaverse. It expanded WhatsApp. It courted regulators with new privacy promises. But its accountability for Myanmar remained elusive. Victims filed lawsuits. Human rights organizations demanded transparency. Facebook resisted most attempts at legal exposure, claiming immunity under Section 230 of the US Communications Decency Act. It argued that as a platform, not a publisher, it could not be held liable for user content. But critics pointed to the algorithms. The core argument was, this Facebook didn't just passively host harmful content, it actively amplified it. Its design choices, ranking systems, and engagement-driven architecture created an ecosystem where hate spread faster than truth, where virality mattered more than verification, where genocide propaganda was not suppressed but supercharged. When the cameras left and the headlines moved on, the Rohingya remained scattered across the hills of southern Bangladesh, trapped behind barbed wire fences inside Myanmar, or drifting stateless across a world that rarely acknowledged them. The genocide had passed in the eyes of the global media, but for those who survived, nothing had ended. And Facebook, a company that had once promised to connect the world, was still there this time, as an echo, a reminder of what had been lost. In the sprawling refugee camps of Cox's Bazar, now the largest in the world, Rohingya families live in plastic shelters. Children born there know no country. Their birth certificates are either unrecognized or non-existent. Most families fled with nothing, but many brought their phones. And on those phones, Facebook. For many, it remains a lifeline. It connects relatives across borders. It helps share updates, news, hope. But for others, it is a constant trauma loop. Photos of lost homes, posts about massacres, memories of the incitement that preceded the violence. Survivors scroll through a timeline that will not let them forget. Outside the camps, the legal war has begun. In 2021, a groundbreaking $150 billion lawsuit was filed against Facebook, now Meta, in US courts on behalf of Rohingya refugees. The suit alleged that Facebook's algorithms and negligence directly contributed to the genocide. It argued that the company had failed to act despite knowing for years that its platform was being used to spread hate speech and organize violence. The suit invoked legal principles beyond traditional content liability. It targeted Facebook's design, the very algorithms that rewarded inflammatory posts, the lack of Burmese language content moderation, the delayed removals of verified hate pages. It also cited internal documents and whistleblower testimony that showed Facebook had been repeatedly warned. Facebook's defense, as expected, leaned on Section 230 protections. They claimed immunity as a platform, not a publisher. They denied direct responsibility. But critics saw something else, a dangerous precedent. If a company can algorithmically amplify hate that leads to real-world atrocities and face no consequences, what does that say about the digital architecture governing the 21st century? International legal scholars began to ask whether Facebook had violated global human rights standards. Could the UN or the International Criminal Court hold a tech company accountable? Could digital platforms be considered complicit in crimes against humanity if they enabled the coordination and incitement of genocide? The questions were no longer hypothetical. In 2022, a coalition of human rights organizations submitted evidence to The Hague, asking prosecutors to consider Facebook's role in facilitating the genocide. While the ICC can only prosecute individuals, the evidence served a symbolic purpose to place big tech within the moral framework of war crimes. But while courts and lawyers debated liability, the Rohingya waited. Back in Rakhine, those who remained faced a new kind of prison. Entire villages were fenced off by the military. Movement was restricted. Food deliveries were controlled. Internet access was denied. Even as Myanmar transitioned through political reforms and a short-lived civilian government under Aung San Suu Kyi, the Rohingya were excluded. Facebook remained a powerful force in the country. Despite the international backlash, usage continued. Pages that once spread hate were sometimes reborn under new names. New platforms like TikTok emerged, but Facebook still dominated. It was and remains the primary space where public discourse unfolds in Myanmar. Meta, attempting to repair its image, launched community standards initiatives. It announced more investments in Burmese language moderation. It partnered with civil society groups. But the damage had been done. One former Facebook employee speaking anonymously reflected, "We were racing to scale the world, but we didn't build brakes. We didn't think about what would happen when a platform this powerful landed in a country with no digital immune system." Digital colonialism, that's what some began to call it. The idea that platforms created in Silicon Valley could reshape foreign societies without accountability. That global South nations were being treated as testing grounds, as expansion targets, as user acquisition numbers, not as communities with their own vulnerabilities, histories, and fragilities. In Myanmar, Facebook wasn't just a neutral platform. It was the loudest voice in the room, and it had no idea what it was saying. Activists warned that the Rohingya genocide might not be the last atrocity enabled by algorithm. They pointed to similar patterns in Ethiopia, India, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines. In each case, Facebook was late to act. In some, it still hadn't acted. The same design flaws, the same business incentives, the same human consequences. And so the question deepened. Was Facebook's failure in Myanmar a bug or a feature? The genocide in Myanmar is not the only warning. It is the clearest. A story of what happens when a technology designed to connect people is unleashed in a world without safety nets, without rules, without memory. A story where the cost of connection measured in lives, not likes, was written in fire and silence. But the story isn't only about Myanmar, because the same platform design, the same algorithmic bias, the same corporate culture that ignored early warnings in Rakhine also failed in Sri Lanka, where anti-Muslim riots were fueled by viral Facebook rumors. In India, where lynchings were sparked by fake news and hate speech. In Ethiopia, where civil war narratives and incitement to violence flourished in ethnic conflict zones. In the Philippines, where disinformation helped entrench an authoritarian regime. The pattern is no longer isolated, it is systemic. The root of that system lies in a simple business model: engagement equals profit. And nothing engages like outrage. Facebook's algorithms are designed to surface content that keeps users clicking. Anger spreads faster than empathy. Rumors travel further than corrections. Hate binds people more effectively than hope. And the more time you spend on the platform, the more ads you see. It's not conspiracy, it's code. But code is written by people. And the choice to prioritize growth over governance was never neutral. It was deliberate. The systems that allowed genocide-inciting posts in Myanmar to go viral were the same systems that rewarded sensationalism everywhere else. And even after the consequences were known, even after 700,000 people were driven from their homes, thousands killed, entire villages erased, those systems remain intact. Meta has apologized. But apologies do not dismantle architecture. They do not restore the dead. They do not unmake the algorithm. So where does accountability begin? Not in courtrooms alone. The international legal framework struggles to hold multinational corporations to account. Facebook claims immunity under US law. Victims, refugees, and human rights lawyers must fight for standing just to be heard. There is no global body that regulates big tech the way we regulate pharmaceuticals or financial institutions, despite the fact that digital platforms now impact everything from democracy to mental health to genocide. Facebook's internal oversight board, created in response to mounting pressure, was intended to function as a kind of Supreme Court for content decisions. But its power is limited. It cannot force changes to algorithms. It cannot compel transparency. It cannot deliver justice. And yet there is movement. Scholars, journalists, civil society groups, and digital rights activists around the world are calling for a new kind of regulation, one that sees platforms not just as companies, but as infrastructures with public responsibility. Proposals include mandatory human rights due diligence in every market a platform operates, legally binding transparency around content moderation, algorithm design, and data handling, global funding for independent digital literacy programs in at-risk nations, clear legal liability for algorithmic amplification of dangerous content, reparations or justice funds for communities harmed by platform-driven violence. Some countries have taken first steps. The European Union passed the Digital Services Act, which imposes stricter requirements on platform accountability. But enforcement remains weak, and many countries lack the leverage or political will to confront tech giants whose revenues rival national GDPs. In Myanmar, the victims continue to wait. Some survivors have become activists. Others have withdrawn in grief. Their stories are recorded in refugee camp libraries, in human rights archives, in affidavits sealed for international tribunals. Many have no homes to return to. Many still lack citizenship. But they carry with them the memory of how a digital platform failed them and the world. And Facebook, it rebranded. In 2021, it became Meta. The name change signaled a new Chapter 1 focused on virtual reality immersive experiences and the so-called metaverse. But the infrastructure of the old world of newsfeeds, groups, and algorithmic targeting still powers billions of users each day. The rebranding did not include reparations. It did not include accountability. It did not include justice. And so the question now is not what Facebook was. It is what we allow it to continue being. As citizens, we can pressure lawmakers. As consumers, we can demand transparency. As societies, we must decide whether global platforms should be allowed to grow unchecked, operating above the laws of the countries in which they profit. Because if Myanmar taught us anything, it's that technology is not neutral. It amplifies the values embedded in its design. And when that design rewards division, dismisses responsibility, and distances itself from the bodies left behind, then what it enables is not connection. It is complicity. The genocide in Myanmar was not a failure of one company alone. It was the failure of a global system that put speed before safety scale, before ethics, and engagement before truth. But that system is made by people, and people can unmake it. The question is, will we scroll past as we always do while the next fire is lit?